Hi all, and welcome to wheelchair fencing panel discussion, talking to our highest performing athletes and seeing how they can support both standing and seated fencers and wheelchair fencers across the range of participation to be the best people they can be. Welcome all of you. So our panel today includes Nik Diaper, UK Sport Institute Head of Paralympic Performance Support, Piers, Gilliver, and Dimitri, hopefully I got that right, who are both world-class wheelchair fencing athletes, Paralympians, kind of world champions, medalists all over the place. And are you the most decorated fencers that we've ever seen in the UK, do you think? Probably. Can we
Not
say that?
quite, wasn't
Not quite.
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if we can quite say that yet, but we've still got
Dim's getting close, but yeah, I think there's one guy it's just ahead. So
okay. Almost most decorated fences we've ever had in the UK. Um, Great. Welcome all of you. And if anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Rick Rodgers, British Fencing Inclusion Officer, and I'll be hosting the session today. So we've got about 40 minutes of discussion, which could take a little longer. We've got an hour and a half of uh, like blocked off for this, so just feel free to go with it. And then at the end, we'll have questions from our audience. First question, obviously, to tell a bit, to open a bit more for those who don't know you. Can you each tell us a little bit more about you? What's your why? What draws you into working in this space as an individual? Um, and Nik, if you can start, can you tell us about your role with UK Sports Institute and what you do to input into the space for Paralympics?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Good afternoon, those on the call and anyone listening. So my name is Nik Diaper. I'm Head of Paralympic Performance Support at the UK Sports Institute. I've been working in elite Paralympic performance support for over 20 years now. My first Paralympic Games was Athens, 2004. So I think now got about 8 Paralympic Games under my belt, including summer and winter. So in terms of my UKSI role, I basically have strategic oversight to ensure that the performance support services that we provide to the sports that invest in us, of which wheelchair fencing is one of those, are specific and tailored to the specific needs of Paralympic athletes. It's an interesting question, is what are the different needs of Paralympic athletes compared to Olympic athletes? You know, are they the same, or are they different? So my role focuses on ensuring we can deliver something in that space. And my why is really, I'm happy to admit I accidentally came into Paralympic sport. It wasn't a deliberate career pathway that I chose, but having accidentally arrived in it way back in 2002, it was a world that I just found fascinating, primarily because of the unique problem-solving capability that you have to have as someone who works in this space. At that time, I was a practitioner. And I just found it so refreshing and so interesting that there was so much that was unknown in this space, and that you have to come from it from a very, very specific athlete specific angle or an N equals 1. So I love the creativity and the problem solving approach. And I then just developed a bug for wanting to make the world a bit more of an inclusive place, and dare I say the role that I think Paralympic sport can do to shine a spotlight on some of those issues that pervade within our society. So there's both sort of performance reasons that I love it, and then there's also a much more holistic, personal, social reason that I think it's important.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nik. Dimitri, if we can go to you.
Yeah, I guess I started fencing at school, as kind of like a hobby sport. But I really quickly fell in love with it. I progressed from doing it once a week to twice a week, 3 times, and then I competed in the UK school games in 2011 in Sheffield, which is where I met Piers, actually, unfortunately for him. And then, yeah. And then, from there, it kind of snowballed. I attended kind of monthly training camps with the squad who were preparing for the London Games at the time, and really got inspired to kind of take the sport further and try and qualify for Rio, which was my kind of like my first big realistic Paralympic ambition. And I think from then on, kind of fencing's become more than just, enjoying the sport for me. It's really trying to it's really about trying to make yourself better, and as good as you can be, in every way, not just from the sport, but as a person as well. I think now, especially after Paris, looking forward to how can we help build fencing, particularly wheelchair fencing, more in this country as well. So I guess, it started out as kind of pure enjoyment for the sport, but now there's a lot of other factors that are going into it as well, which is what's kind of driving me as well.
Bro. So you've known each other for over 10 years and worked together all that time.
Yeah, well over 10 years.
Wow. That's fun. That must be lovely to have that team camaraderie for that length of time and still be going strong.
Yeah.
You were also in the campaign about getting more PE access to disabled participants, weren't you, Dimitri?
Yeah,
After
that was
Paris.
it was an initiative that Paralympics GB were launching, and they were talking about quite a lot in Paris. So, I was fortunate to be helping with that as well.
Oh. And Piers, the famous Piers Gilliver.
Yeah, so
Last
for
but
me,
not least, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, kind of, yeah, quite similar to Dimitri, really, quite similar story. So for me, basically, I was just looking for a hobby at first. Never really sporty before, and so when I came across wheelchair fencing, it was just so different to any other sport, and so I just immediately loved it, really. So I went full time about 15 years ago now, and yeah, I was had the mispleasure of meeting Dimitri there along the journey. Um, yeah, and like I said, it's been great. We've kind of come through the sport together. We've grown up together, and it's great that we kind of yeah we made able to stay great mates, and yeah, a lot of similar things. So for me personally, I kind of yeah, Rio was my first games. I kind of watched London as a spectator and just knew that that was a dream really, and so I kind of started off as basically just pure sort of chasing medals and chasing those kind of dreams you have when you start. But I think the why now is there is the same as Dim, where it's like it's purely based on yeah. For me, I really enjoy the problem solving, as Nick said. So for me, it's like how do I problem solve each day, different problems, different solutions. Yeah, and as well like that idea of constantly improving something. So, you never finish. There's always the next thing, next thing. So for me, that's what kind of keeps me here, basically.
And and your brother is a ballet dancer. Is that right? Is a
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
professional ballet dancer. So I remember hearing a long time ago that ballet and fencing, like the ballet came from fencing practices. So do you think there's some sort of like genetic kind of element in the both of you doing like you're basically doing the same activity but with different like one of you holds the swords and one of you
Yeah, yeah.
holds the
I think
shoes.
yeah, I think it's definitely that similar sort of personality where like yeah, for him he works incredibly hard. It's like the amount of hours training is kind of crazy, really, and yeah. So I think both of us have that inner sort of determination, and when you find something, no matter how obscure, like wheelchair fencing, like then yeah, like you kind of just take it to the limits, really, and I think we both kind of done that in our different ways.
Great. So talking about you've just come back from, I say just come back, you're a little bit, you've just come back from your break, having come back from Paris, I guess. Um, and what is that experience like as an athlete going through to the highest level of the sporting, of the sporting world in that respect? And what does it take, do you think, to reach that level as a wheelchair fencer, physically, mentally, um, emotionally, I guess?
I'd say, for me, I've done 3 games and everyone is different. I'd say that the biggest thing across all of them is the games is the best experience in your whole life and also the worst experience in your whole life. I think for me personally, yeah, like it's one of those things where, you put so many years of your life, so much focus constantly, I think, like some of my family work 9 to 5s and they can come home, they can switch off and if the company goes down the drain, it doesn't really matter. Whereas for us, we kind of we work more than 9 to 5, and then you get home and you've still got more work to do, more planning, more thinking, more video analysis, and as well you're so emotionally invested in it that yeah, and it's not just 4 years of work. It's actually so for me in Paris, people say, oh, it's 4 years work. It's like, well, it's not. It's 15 years work. This is the pinnacle I've come to, and really on the result. So for me, when I won in Tokyo, it was just yeah, life changing, which had its ups and downs. I think suddenly once I'd achieved my dream of a gold medal, it's like where do I go from here? Your whole identity is based around this one thing. So on the one hand, it's it changes your life. On the other hand, it changes it in a negative way. And for me in Paris, similar thing where to be honest, I hadn't achieved in almost all my events, and trying to sort of get through that as well. Like, it's not just a competition, it's everything you and your friends and family and everyone has worked for. So yeah, it's a strange experience in a nutshell.
Yeah. And you, Dimitri, like you had that chest full of bling coming back from Paris. And like, what was that like for you to kind of to feel the other side of things, I guess, in terms of like in like Piers was challenged and it feels like he underperformed. I think he did great, Piers, especially with
Cheers.
with the challenges that you were facing, in the year before. I think, you really came back strong. But Dimitri, like getting to that sort of, no space on you on you left, really. It's a good job you're so buff.
I think, to be honest, I think the primary emotion I was feeling was relief, because Piers summed it up really well in terms of how much pressure there is, and that's not pressure in a sense of everyone, not just pressure in the sense of everyone's expecting you to win, but the pressure you put on yourself because you care about this thing so deeply. And I think it is that thing of, especially given the position that we were in, we've been fairly successful athletes for quite a number of years. So there is a lot of expectation on you from everyone watching, from your team, from your competitors even as well. So it's a lot to handle. And, a lot of the work we did was how do we put in our best performance despite all that pressure. So honestly, relief was the first kind of emotion I felt. And then, for me, the games were a big mix of huge personal achievement, but also a lot of painful knowledge of how short I was in some areas and how much more work there was going to need to be to fix these problems, and then some going forward. So it is, I think, like Piers said, unbelievable. It still hasn't really fully sunk in, to be honest, but it's hard to just think about this one moment because it is a constantly changing thing.
Yeah.
And that, if you want to experience any kind of feeling like this ever again, that the amount of work you have to do is going to be way, way more than anything you've ever done before. So I think, if I'm being honest, Piers summed it up really well. It's just incredible highs, but a lot of pressure, and it doesn't really end to.
Can you guys both share something that you recall, like specifically working on to help you deal with that pressure? Was there something that your coaches provided for you, or the team at the world class program? Discussions you had, like some kind of tidbits so that I mean, I'm going through a lot of pressure in my life at the moment outside of my working environment. It's always good to hear like methodologies that people use to kind of help themselves be present in the moment rather than to dealing with that challenge.
Yes, I'd say it's quite. I'd say the answer is going to be quite a annoying one. I'd say, yeah, it really is like completely individual would be
Yeah.
the thing. And I think this is one of the our sort of key values is you have to have that individuality constantly. We're all completely different individuals, completely different people. For some people, they need the pressure. Some people they can't handle it. Some they want to balance. And then also what even if you've got two people that have the same goal, the way to get there is completely different. So one guy he might relieve pressure by listening to music. One guy he might try and overload or see his family. Like there's all sorts of different ways really. So I'd say the really key thing is how can you have self-understanding of who you are as a person and what works for you, and then you can go about how to sort of do that on the day basically.
Yeah, I think adding on to what Piers is saying, we took a lot of time to really break down the sport and question what it takes what the sport is, first of all, and then on top of that, how do you do it at games? Because I think those things are two different questions. So, and like you said, you need to have your understanding of self to then think, okay, well, this is who I am, this is what my tendencies are, or what I like or what I don't like. But at the end of the day, I need to be able to do this or cope with this because that's the pressure, or that's those are the conditions for competing at the highest level. So how do I get myself from where and who I am now to where I need to be? So there is a lot of questions that go into it. And to be honest, I don't think you ever really stop or should ever really stop asking those questions because you're constantly changing as a person. And to be honest, the environment of the sport will be constantly changing as well. So it is a work in progress. But I guess your ability to, at any given point, to break down a potentially big and stressful picture and think, what can I focus on at this point and where do I need to get to?
Nice. talking about that environment, I heard on the grapevine, and now tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong, that someone did a 3D recording of the space you're going to be in, and then like projected that where you were training for Paris. Is that firstly, is that true? And secondly, how did that impact, if it is true, how did that impact your like preparation?
I think that is like one of the ideas we had. I think, yeah, I think we kind of looked at, different ideas, different things really. And I think, yeah, there's lots of different things. We heard that from, I think it was maybe like an actor or someone had done that. And so like, one of the things we did was try to collect as much sort of ideas as possible. And then we could sort of go down, what routes really worked for us.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, like Piers said, basically.
Cool. And Nick, like you opened up the question at the very beginning in your introduction, and now obviously it's a very nuanced question. So, is there a huge difference between the needs of an Olympian and the needs of a Paralympian? Or, and now, you know, correct me if my assumptions are, do you feel that maybe the challenges are overcoming the barriers that the Paralympians face to get them to the same starting point as Olympians, and then everything's the same?
In brief, the answer is yes and no. Again, bit like Piers previously, not a very helpful answer. But if I extrapolate a bit further, so I mean, look, one of the obvious differences between an Olympic athlete and a Paralympic athlete in most cases is you've got an individual with an impairment and one who doesn't, or at least a physical impairment, because we recognize that there are many Olympic athletes who will have neurodivergent traits, as an example. That strictly speaking, doesn't mean to say that. I don't like the term able-bodied, but let's just say non-disabled for now. And yes, there's a whole host of societal and cultural and childhood barriers that somebody born with a disability, or who might have acquired a disability early in life, may have had to face as they navigate through a world that, again, if we're being brutally honest, is not designed or built for people with a disability. We live in a world whereby I think most people will be familiar with the social model of disability. And I don't profess to be a sociologist or an expert in this space, but my understanding of that model is that, it dictates that an individual is not disabled by their impairment itself. They're disabled by the world around them. And I think there's an element on that I think is very true for people who live with a disability. So if I go specifically to your question, you could argue that there are no differences between an Olympic athlete and a Paralympic athlete. I love the way Dimitri framed it, is that at the end of the day, I need to be able to go into the performance environment and deliver whatever it is I need to deliver. So if you take that at the basic level, that's the same. It's a high pressure environment. The stakes are high, requires a huge amount of time, dedication, expertise, support staff, etc. So on one level, it's the same. But Piers really highlighted the need for individuality. And when you go to the individual level, again, depending on the specific impairment that a para-athlete has, I would argue that there are some things that are very different, and they will impact, for example, the type of equipment or specific equipment that the athlete might need. They probably will have an impact on the type of injury, illness prevention strategy that might be required for that athlete. And there's probably a whole bunch of holistic characteristics that come with that a coach or support staff probably need to be aware of. Most people who work in Paralympic sport will be familiar with classification. Classification doesn't exist in the way it does in non-disabled sport. So there's some nuances in that. So to summarize, my argument and my position is there are some unique differences for supporting elite Paralympic athletes that require slightly different set of questions. They require, in some cases, a different set of specialist expertise from the practitioner and possibly even the coach. Again, depends.
Mm-hmm.
But I will also say there is no such thing as a Paralympic athlete, because on the one hand, it could look like a bocce player who is an electric chair and who is non-verbal. And on the other hand, it could look like an athlete who, to most people, wouldn't even notice that they had a physical disability, missing some fingers on a hand, for an example, and could be everything in between. So there is just an infinite number of combination of different types of impairments that make up a Paralympic athlete. And I'll come back to Piers's point. The secret really is unlocking when you go to the individual level. At the end of the day, that athlete needs to be able to do whatever it is they need to be able to do. What does that mean given the specific impairment they have. And how do you ask the right questions of the process? So what's the performance problem? Are we asking the right questions, or are we being lazy and applying a non-disabled, able-bodied Olympic performance model to something that is a different model? And so allow it to be different, explore the things that are unique, get the athletes involved. I think in Piers and Dimitri, you have two athletes who know exactly how their bodies work better than probably even their consultants, if they have them, know them, and they can solve the problems. So it's ensuring they are part of the problem solving process and not doing stuff to them, but doing stuff with them, engaging them in the process. I can see I'm getting a few nods from them, so hopefully I'm speaking the right language as far as they're concerned.
Yeah, guys, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely it's an interesting question, because it's kind of like, yeah, I think Nick said it really well. It's like, it is that real yes and no. I'd say you've got, I'd say starting from the start, you've got like things are very different. So for example, like, for a non-disabled person, if they want to get fencing, they just find a local club and turn up. Whereas I think all of us have faced being turned away from clubs, not being able to do things you wanted, people. So I'd say that's very different. So I'd say your situation is quite different. So being able to access equipment, the wheelchairs, the frames, being able to even access the clubs, the right coaches, and even for us now, like, there's a different pay level for Olympic athletes and Paralympic athletes from UK sport. And so, I mean, even now for us at the top level, there's still these challenges of inequality.
Yeah.
So I think I'd say situationally there's always these challenges, but I'd say when it comes down to the actual sort of sport wise, it is that individuality which goes across every sport. So, for example, like me and Dim have completely different fencing styles. I'd say that's mostly based on actually personality rather than impairment. And I'd say that should be across Olympic and Paralympic. So yeah, whether you've got a guy with whatever disability or no disability, actually, it should be the same question of, yeah, like Dim said, this person needs to do this on the day. Whether they've got no impairment or an impairment, it's the same thing of problem solving. How do they get to the right point with whatever they've got to use, basically?
You want to add
Yeah,
to it, Jim?
yeah. Not too much, to be honest. I think, like Peach said, it's the exact same. But I just wanted to say, I think at the top level, especially at Olympic and Para, like, to get there, the process is pretty similar in terms of you need to improve. How do you get that done? And I think, working with individuals who really want to achieve success at the highest level, I don't think you're going to find you might have to do things in a slightly different way due to impairment, whatever, but the process is the exact same. And I think you'll find that those who are achieving or trying to achieve at the highest level will work the exact same way. So I wouldn't think practitioners or people who are looking to get into parasport would have to worry too much about at that higher level. Do you know what I mean? Like, too much differences in personalities and way of working. But I think getting there, yeah, there are a lot more kind of challenges that are faced.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things we do in our coaching CPDs, and anyone who's going to attend the neurodiversity session at the end of the week will definitely hear is that idea about coaching the individual rather than coaching like the perfect athlete. Have we ever met a perfect athlete? I don't think so.
What was you going to say?
And it's great to hear that that's what you guys have been experiencing recently.
Yeah.
We've got quite a few kind of up and coming seated defensive grassroots participants who are going to be watching this, who are on our call right now. What do you think coaches could do that you've experienced having the best quality support that you can have at your level now? What can translate to a grassroots coach that they could maybe do to support athletes better, do you think?
I think one for me was helping gain a sense of independence, to be honest, because I think that's a key part of elite level improvement and learning, taking ownership of what you're doing and accountability as well. And I think, speaking from personal experience, I had a lot of support growing up, and I wouldn't be, the athlete I am without that kind of support, particularly from family, etc. But I think it's a key part that sometimes can get missed out, that sense of independence, especially if you've, acquired a disability quite young or grown up with one. And I think, I noticed the biggest changes in my performance when, I was held more accountable and took more accountability for my learning as well. And I really think that made all the difference in the consistency, which, well, I'm trying and hoping to show it now.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point Jim's made, because I think it's a tricky one where, so I think for all of us, it's a big thing trying to psychologically live with having a disability and get, especially when it's acquired, how do you kind of get used to that change and sort of overcome that? But I'd say, yeah, you really see big improvements when people can sort of overcome that and accept what it is. So it's like, okay, this is my situation, accept what it is. Now, how do we deal with that? And how can you really push things to the max? Because it is always that challenge where, especially with disabilities new or you've always had it, whichever way you take, you can kind of be stuck into this sort of, you don't problem solve. I think, yeah, for me personally, I think I could have been a lot more independent earlier on, but I just couldn't see at the time. And I think, yeah, for example, like, me and Dim now, where it works well is, you don't question disability. It is what it is. Now, how do we get the max use out of what we've got? And something we say to every fencer, if it comes to the system is, cool, you've got what you got. How do we make the most out of it? Have you got any power in your legs? Great. You got 1%. Let's use it that'll help us fence. You got, 10% core. Perfect. We'll use that. You've got nothing, none of either of those at all. That's also fine. How do we then find a way that you can, produce power? So I think it's a good point of like, how do you sort of, it's a tough one, but psychologically accept what you've got and then make the best out of it for performance reasons.
Would you like to add anything, Nick? Because that was beautiful, guys. In terms of like, yeah, use what you've got, find that independence. I hear a lot in the studies that I do at home about autonomy and responsibility, personal responsibility as an athlete,
Yeah.
and I think that stretches across all levels of sport, like Paralympic, Olympic, standing, seated, etc. You're a better athlete if you own it than
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
than if it's and I think coaches, I feel like coaches are better if they understand that they're not there to layer something on you, but to shepherd you through that ownership. But it'll be interesting to hear from you, Nick, what you see happening at the high performance level that could again filter down into our grassroots clubs, in terms of coaching that might be able to help our up and coming athletes.
Yeah, I think Piers and Dim have summarized it quite nicely, really, and ultimately what they're talking about is an individual approach. Now, admittedly, that's difficult when you have limited resources or when you don't see somebody on a frequent basis. So what I don't want to do is give an answer based on some assumption that I know the reality of what it's like in a fencing club. I don't. I think what we do well at the elite level with elite Paralympic performance is exactly what Piers and Dim have been describing there, is a very, very specialized individual approach. Piers and Dimitri almost certainly will have an individual athlete plan or an individual development plan. They might call it different things. That plan will clearly dictate what's important to these guys, who is involved in that plan, what it means for coaching, what it means for practitioners. But ultimately, they will have worked with a group of people to determine this is what I'm going after. This is what, to Dim's point, this ultimately, no matter who I am, I need to be able to go to LA, let's frame LA now, and do this. So whatever this is, that's clearly articulated. Everyone who's supporting these guys will know what their role is to support Dim and Piers to achieve the thing that they're trying to achieve. And there'll be a whole host of people that are involved in there. So again, it would be naive to say that a fencing club needs to do that, because that's not the reality on the ground. But I think the principle is still a sound one: is what is the need of the individual, and I'm sure in Dim and Piers' plan, it's not just about their fencing; it's about what's important to them outside of fencing, because that's really important. So if you take that principle, yes, they're elite performers, but ultimately, like everyone, they're human beings. And they do stuff outside of fencing, and it's really important that they do stuff outside of fencing, because they both know at some point fencing will come to an end. So if you take that analogy of an individual in a club setting, again, how do you best support the needs of the individual? But also, really importantly, how do you keep an open mind? Because I think the challenge with disability, particularly when you're a non-disabled person and it's something that perhaps you're not familiar with, and dare I say it, some people are a little bit anxious or nervous because it's just something new. The biggest mistake you can make is, I think, have a fixed mindset, and in your mind tell yourself, oh gosh, either I don't know how I can do this, or I'm not sure this individual can do that. The beauty of Paralympic sport is, 90% of the athletes do stuff that probably they were told they would never be able to do by somebody along the way, even by people who think that they're informed. Like I've probably done it myself, written athletes off before. I've definitely seen coaches do it early in a pathway, saying, no, they don't quite have what it takes. They don't have what it takes because you haven't created the right environment for that athlete, or you're viewing through a non-disabled lens. And so in your non-disabled performance model, you think they don't have what it takes. But if you create the right environment and you empower the athletes and you engage them, they'll find a way to do the stuff that you don't know how they can do it. They will find a way in many cases. So I think that's probably the biggest message is be big with your thinking. Like, don't have a fixed mindset, and don't worry if you don't know the answers, because the answers aren't immediately there. So how do you create, I guess, a partnership with the individual or the groups that you have to find a way to make this work, whatever the problem solving thing is? At that level, it's unlikely to be a very technical fencing specific thing. It's probably some some big ticket items that between you and the individual, you could find a way to solve. And it might simply be, how do I have more sessions with you on a more regular basis because I've got a transport problem to solve. Like, it could be as basic as that. Or it could be as simple as, how do we get a wheelchair fencing setup in the club so that I can actually come and do that.
Yeah, how can I encourage you as a club to get your
Yeah.
frames out more than once a week?
Yeah. I think the worst thing that could happen is someone comes to the environment, experiences some sort of subconscious reason where they don't feel welcome. Like, I think that would be the worst thing, where someone comes and for whatever reason, even though no one's deliberately trying to make them feel unwelcome, they feel unwelcome, and like, actually, it just doesn't feel like the right place for me. So if you reverse engineer that, what would it feel like the first person someone goes to try wheelchair fencing or inclusive fencing? How are they made to feel by the physical environment, but also the people in that environment, the language, the stuff they use, the responses to the questions? That's probably the most important thing at that stage, I would think.
Can we throw that back to our athletes and say, I'm sure you guys, Erica is cheering you on. I'm sure you guys have had, like all of us disabled sports participants have had experiences where you definitely haven't been welcomed or felt welcomed and felt excluded, and also an experience where you've really been included. Do you think you can share a bit of that so that we can learn from the what not to do, as well as maybe what really made you feel welcomed, especially in your early time?
For me, my first coaches who were working at the school I was at, they were incredibly, keen and open-minded to work with me and to help, cultivate my interest in wheelchair fencing. They'd never had any, para sport experience really before, but they went away, they did a bit of research, and they gave it a go, and I ended up working with one of them, John Sloman, for I think 6 years it was, up until I went to Rio, basically, and just after. So again, that was really, I don't think I fully appreciated at the time how lucky I was to just, the first time I wanted to try something, the school and the people working there were so open and eager to get me involved. And unfortunately, I know that's not a reality for the majority of disabled people or children who want to try sport. I think it takes a lot. It can often take a lot more kind of trying and different attempts to find somewhere that's willing to be that open. So I can say I'm incredibly lucky and grateful, because I don't know if without that I would have been where I am right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, where it's like, to me, it's no coincidence that both of us had really good first coaches. Because I've also know a lot of people that have kind of, they want to try wheelchair fence, and they go to a club, they don't feel welcome, and you never see them again. Whereas for us too, me and Dim were lucky that our first coach was really sort of, I had a different coach, but same thing, of really welcoming, really trying to include me whatever way he could. And yeah, just that he was really all about that thing of problem solving, cool, never worked a wheelchair fence before. I'm gonna go away, learn what I can, find ways to adapt the club to it. So early days it was white plastic garden chairs, but for me that's all you need to just get started. Do you know what I mean? Like just and it was him just cool. What have we got around us? How can we still make it work? And I think I think that I don't think either of us would have been here if it wasn't for having a really welcoming first try, basically.
Rick, if I can add, because I think
Of course, yeah.
all of us have stuff in our constraints in the environments that we work that are beyond our control. We don't live in an ideal world where we could, if there's a physical barrier to an infrastructure, we can just sort of magically wave a wand and the problem goes away. But one of the things we can control is your own response to what's happening. So, like, brilliant examples, both of these guys here, two of the most successful wheelchair fencers that the GB have ever had, are saying the critical importance of the first people who ever introduced them to the sport. Imagine if those two people that they're talking about had the opposite view and somehow just went in a way that turned Dim or Piers off. We wouldn't be having this conversation with them now. So it's super powerful that we can all control how we respond to that initial thing. That's within your gift to control. A lot of the other stuff you can't immediately control. You've got to wait for the right opportunity to redesign a building or something, or make it more accessible. But what you can control is your response to the first person who comes to you, and just how powerful. I mean, it's a beautiful example these two have shared, how powerful that is. And that's free. You don't need money to do that, and you can literally do it as soon as you come off the call.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I don't need to imagine what it would look like for if someone got turned away when they were a wheelchair user trying to join fencing, because I personally experienced it in 2009 when I realized I was going to be a wheelchair user, and I had been a standing fencer mostly for performance work rather than for sport. But I reached out and was like, hey, can I join your club? And the three local clubs in the area, I was South London based. Three local clubs turned me away. And then that was it. I was done. I was like, okay, cool. I'm not going to be a fencer. And it was only years later where I saw the opportunity to support what was at the time the BDF in their transition, and I was like, oh, cool. I can help that not happen again. And that little fire was still obviously in me. So I unfortunately had the opposite response. And now I don't think I'd have got to the level where either of these guys were at, but and especially I'd have been kicked out of the sport because my condition, though recognised at the time, is no longer recognised. But yeah, I having had that other side of the coin, I definitely know exactly what that feels like, what that's like, and how it just kicks you to the curb. So I mean, like, obviously the answer is frames and chairs everywhere, but that's not possible. There's a question here that I said, if you could magically give every fencing club in the UK something to make them more inclusive tomorrow, what would it be? And like, I don't. I guess from there's no need to answer that question anymore, because the answer is a coach who is open-minded and wanting to support. Is there anything else do you think you might add to that?
I guess the attitude, to sum it up, like you said, it's I think the behavior is the key thing, because whatever the sport is, Olympic, at the end of the day, when you do it at the top level, it's always expensive. You're always buying better equipment, or better running shoes, or for us, it's certainly an expensive sport. But at the end of the day, if you've got this open attitude, this questioning attitude, how can we do whatever? How can we get started whatever we've got? You can then grow your passion, and if it's something that you then decide, no, I want to take this to the next level, then you can spend more time to be like, okay, well, where can I go and do this properly? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes you're lucky, and like me, where you have access to some of the best to some of the best equipment at the time from the get-go, which is great. But if not, like Piers said, you can start with plastic chairs. Do you know what I mean? If that's all you have, and then you can get to the same place.
I mean, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say you can now go and get the SwordSeat as well, I guess. And that wasn't, I didn't put that question in there, but now I'm thinking about and hearing your plastic chair statement. we have that solution solved for. So any coaches, if you haven't bought the SwordSeat and you want to support that, go to our website. This is our ad break. But like,
Rick, and I'll just add, I'll add to that. I mean, a slightly different, well, not a different perspective, but just different lenses. I'm a firm believer that if you build it, they will come. And so there is a slight chicken and egg situation here. We're talking about ultimately a conversation around how you guys have a sport that's more inclusive and reaches a wider group of people, not just wheelchair fencing from the earlier conversations, me, you and Chris had earlier. I think what are every environment will have some sort of barrier that for some is a barrier for certain groups of people. So if you have a facility, just have you just stopped to think like what are the barriers here? There's some you won't be able to change. Some will be invisible barriers. Like what how do you get feedback, genuine, clean feedback of what some of those barriers are, and how do you start to just slowly unpick that? Because if you build it, they will come. If you don't build it, they will never come, and we can't just sort of keep waiting accidentally for the next Piers or the next Dimitri to come along, because maybe they will, maybe they won't. But I've been in different environments before, different roles, where sometimes you just have to go out of a limb and think if we build it, they will come. It'll take time, and it won't be immediate, but if you build it, they will come.
We get a lot of questions from our coaches, just to add to if you build it, and for your responsive guys, saying, okay, well, I want to be inclusive, but there aren't disabled people here. And obviously that's not true at all. There are definitely disabled people everywhere. What is it that they can do in terms of that advertising, in terms of that outreach, that makes it really clearly welcoming and that shows that they've built it?
Yeah, I think just building up on those points is like, I think a really good example is Bristol Blades. So I think, for years, basically like there wasn't really any wheelchair fences there, then once basically the coaches started sort of, getting the chairs, getting the frames, then basically now there's like, I don't know, maybe like 8, and it's just like so quickly, it's just kind of built and built and built. And then I think once the sort of infrastructure is there that is possible, people then start going there. Then when there's a wheelchair fence already there, and someone else disabled comes along, it's now more inviting. Because I think, it's a funny position being the only disabled person in a club. I think it's always going to happen at a point, but also I think like you do feel very sort of very separate, very different, very sort of self-conscious, and I think that's kind of unavoidable, really, no matter how good people are. But I think having like a group of other disabled people means that actually you've got other people that you feel more comfortable, people that aren't going to treat you differently, people that understand you a bit more. And so I think Nick said it really well. Where it's just like, build it and they will come. And I think the key thing is just how do you sort of really advertise the fact that, look, we've got wheelchair fences here, we've got the equipment, you're more than welcome, rather than sort of maybe we could fit you in.
I think maybe on that as well, like, I think everyone, Googles things these days to find out where the nearest, for example, if you wanted to start fencing, you'll look up online, like, okay, where are clubs nearby? Even if it's saying open to doing wheelchair fencing or doing that on there, there's always that thing of, you're explicitly showing it to people who are looking for it, saying, look, come here and you can get started on this. Because I think, like you say, like, it's good to take the initiative and contact the club to ask, but some people may not feel comfortable doing that or not brave enough for whatever reason. But then if you're literally, signposting it to them saying, yeah, come here, give this a go, you might get more people turning up.
Rick, I'll throw one in. Might be slightly controversial, but just a different way to expand our horizons. And actually, it came up in a previous conversation. If you only view wheelchair fencing through a disability lens, you might say, oh, well, there's not enough people in my local area to make it sustainable. But if you just viewed wheelchair fencing as fencing that takes place in a seated domain, and anybody can do wheelchair fencing, you don't have to be disabled to do wheelchair fencing, it opens up a completely different market. So what if everybody who came to fencing started just doing seated fencing, and then you progress to standing fencing if that's what you wanted to do? And there must be a whole number of people for whom seated fencing might be a more attractive or more realistic offer than standing fencing. Look at walking
Sure.
football and walking netball and all of these other different variations of a sport that just make them more inclusive. That's a really fascinating thing to play with.
Yeah, you'll probably see hearts coming up from Amy, and she is literally talking about this tomorrow and her journey from standing to seated. I fully agree with you, and like I don't know, I think that there is a real benefit to our Olympians, to our standing fencers, in removing their ability to run away, so that they focus on their ability to parry riposte and to that speed in hand. I mean, because I hear stories everywhere I go. I was at an RAF base working with some of the military fencers just last week, showing them the SwordSeat, and they were talking about, how they were telling me stories, as I've heard many times before, about how they competed against one of you guys, or one of the seated fencers, and they were just trounced because of how fast you were, and how responsive, how quick you were, even though they could run away and you couldn't. And like, do you think that there's a real benefit in that? I mean, like, in terms of people learning to sit down and do that sword in hand work.
Yeah, I think it's always been a great benefit, yeah, with the sort of local clubs. And I think at first there is that sort of, they're not really sure, but then once they get sort of stuck in, yeah, it's always good, and they can really start to enjoy it as, yeah, as you said, as almost like, yeah, a different type of fencing. Yeah, fencing's fencing at the end of the day. It's just the really, it's just the subtle changes, and at the end of the day, if people can really sort of, yeah, get involved with it, I think it's great. There's a really good example, which is like, for example, we have like the Open Championships in the UK, and there's also one in France as well, and to basically get able-bodied wheelchair fencer, coaches even sometimes do it. You can just, basically fence in the chair, open to all. And I think that's a really nice one. And I say at the Open we had a couple of months ago, it was is such a great example where we've got classified athletes, non-classified athletes, able-bodied athletes that just competed in this, the standing competition once they do, the wheelchair competition. And I think that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, I think things like that are a really good thing for the sports image as well, because I know I've experienced instances where potentially parasport hasn't been given the same level of respect as the able-bodied or Olympic counterpart, but doing these open competitions really get people to start talking about it and experiencing it firsthand, and they realize that, like you said, Piers, it's fencing. Just potentially you have to do slightly different technical things to create the same, principles of the sport. So yeah, I think things like that are hugely important to raise the profile of the sport as well, and get people to understand what's going on.
Yeah. I think, Rick, sometimes there's a risk we take a very binary view to disable, non-disabled, like it's one or the other. And the reality isn't that. And so, you see this show up when you go to, you guys will have experienced this, hotel rooms that typically will only have X number of accessible rooms, right?
Yeah.
Why can't we just build stuff that is universal? Yes, some rooms might need to have specific adaptations, but if every room was universal in its design, simple things, a wide doorway, wide bathroom, walk-in shower, etc., we wouldn't have half the problems we have. But that problem comes from thinking in a very binary way, that we've got disabled and non-disabled.
Yeah.
And the reality for all of us, even like myself, I can't, yes, I might be non-disabled today, but I could be disabled tomorrow. And ultimately, it's a spectrum, isn't it? Like, some people might genuinely be 100% non-disabled. I'm not sure what 100% disabled looks like. There's no such thing, but bear with me. And ultimately, all of us are on that spectrum. So it isn't an us and them or a binary thing, 0 and 1. It's all areas of gray. And so what we're talking about here is, how do you frame inclusive fencing from, it's not this particular group and that particular group. It's all of us. And ultimately, like we said before, give people a choice of the thing that works for them, based on individually. So I think, sorry, just slightly sort of very, very hypothetical and very deeply philosophical, but I think it's a really fascinating conundrum to play with, the risk that particularly non-disabled people will view through a very binary lens, and that's just not the reality.
I mean, we're really lucky in fencing right now, like in this time period and in this moment in fencing, that our Paralympic world-class program are doing way better than our standard fences in terms of their success level, their skill level. I don't spend a lot of time looking at standing fences, not of interest to me, but we've got a really good world-class program, and then I'm really excited to see what that can feed into. Like we always think of, like you say, that binary, the non-disabled sports up here, the disabled sports down here, and they feed, like you can feed this way. But I think it's really great to be able to feed the other way. And it's all just sport at the end of the day. I mean, as a person who doesn't get to be Paralympian, I live in very inclusive sport in terms of like everyone can play if you just sit down, or everyone can play in their own way. But yeah, I love that we have this opportunity to share in a way that's not this kind of the standard societal view of that. What, like, I don't know if you know the artist Crippen. He's a disabled kind of satire artist, and he's got a very famous like kind of little cartoon of a wheelchair user asking someone to clear the snow off the ramp so that everyone can get up to the school, and the person goes, no, I've got to clear the stairs first because of all these children, you know and then I'll get to you. And I think that's that situation we're in, in the discussion you've brought up here, Nick, as well, in that we're looking at we're trying to look at sport and how we can do sport better, rather than separating it out. Like, is there, if there is, and there's never one thing, but I've got to make a question that is succinct in a square in the net. What do you feel that the clubs can learn from our successful program at the WCP that they can implement in their own spaces, both for their standing and seated participants?
Yeah, I'd say for us, the key principles would be, our real beliefs on the program around sort of, yeah, that real idea of like never accepting anything, kind of always looking for more.
Yeah,
And so it's just like, I think the most dangerous phrase would probably be something like, "Oh, it works. Oh, that'll do." I think that's the most dangerous thing you can do for performance, because actually, if every textbook on the earth says that this is the perfect cart parry, you still need to question it. What books were they? How old was it? Was that book written for Piers, Gilliver, or Dimitri Coutya? No, it wasn't. um, yeah, we found ways actually that doesn't work for us, and so there's nothing sort of concrete. And I think for clubs as well, it really is that idea of how do we really sort of, you've got this individual, whether they're disabled, non-disabled, how do we get them to do what they need to do? And I'd say from a sort of technical perspective, I'd say one of the big problems of coaches in this country is a technical obsession, where everything's just about how perfectly you can make a shape, whereas that's not what the sport's about. If it was gymnastics, definitely, but our sport is about scoring points to win. It's a points-based thing. How do you win on one day every 4 years? And that's what the sport's about, rather than sort of being judged technically of how perfect everything looks. And I'd say just those couple of simple ideas, I think if that could be enforced, it would make such a huge impact on the sport in the country.
that's brilliant. Dim, do you have anything to add?
I think goal setting is also a good skill to have. Sorry, not just a good skill, it's important and essential if you want to get significant improvements. Because I think just turning up and bashing out a few fights and being like, oh yeah, I won those, but if you can't say why, do you know what I mean? Then you've not really learned much. And similarly, if you lost a match and you don't analyze it and go why, then you never know what to work on, and you never improve anything specific. Do you know what I mean? I think you'll get better to a degree of you've kind of done the sport a bit more to know some of the basics a little bit more than you did before, but you won't get that critical improvement. And I think that in itself will lend to motivation as well, because if you kind of just rock up and do the same thing day in, day out, but with no path or a clear idea of a path of progression, then I think it is going to lose some of its yeah, some of its meaning to you. And again, if what you want to do is go and just, you know, blow off some steam, have a bit of fun with fencing, then by all means go do that. But if you're looking to get specific improvement and you really want to try and excel in something, you've got to be more specific with what you're working on.
Brilliant. Nick, do you have anything to add in that respect?
Um, um, I guess a summary of what I've heard from both, and you know, I won't confess to know the entire story of wheelchair fencing in the UK. But if you just take the story of Piers and Dim and a couple of others in recent times, like the success of the world class program is an incredible story, dare I say it, from fairly humble beginnings. You know, yes, reasonably well resourced. Of course, the program I'm sure would always want more money, wouldn't we all? But from fairly humble beginnings with limited resources, because ultimately, these are my words, not Piers, but I think what Piers was saying is where there's a will, there is a way. It's a bit cheesy, but it's true. If there is no will amongst you guys as a community to be more inclusive, nothing else will ever happen. But if there is a will, then all the barriers that probably need to be addressed, ultimately they will get solutions will be found. But there has to be a will, and there has to be a desire to want to do things differently. You know, I think what I heard Piers saying, and I guess I've heard this before, it's a very traditional sport. I can say this as an outsider, right? It's a very, very traditional sport in the way things are done. You know, deeply, deeply traditional. And there might be some really positive things there, but that approach, that philosophy might also be the thing that could be holding it back or stopping some things from changing. And that's a really difficult thing to address. So I think, yeah, where there's a will, there's a way. And, you know, don't be afraid to go against the status quo. What you are trying to do, what we're all trying to do, has never been done before. If it was easy, someone would have already done it. And we can't keep doing things the same, because clearly it's not working, right? Otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. So something has to be done differently, and that takes courage and bravery, and it takes innovation. And sometimes that can be a lonely place if you're the only one trying to do it, and there's lots of people looking at you saying, oh, that's not how to do it, look what they're doing over there in such and such club. I imagine that's hugely damaging. I'm not saying that's happening, by the way. I'm just being deliberately facetious and to provoke some thought.
Yeah. What do you think happens at a high performance level, Nick, that could be implemented for grassroots spaces that's often like being overlooked?
It's a difficult question to answer, Rick, because obviously the difference at high performance level, you have a lot more resourcing and time and specialism that people would have in a typical club thing. But I think the one thing that's true, it's exactly what I've said. It's what Piers was saying. I think Dimitri is saying it's the desire, it's the wanting to do something differently, to be brave, to do what hasn't been done before, and ultimately just do things differently. It could be a tiny thing. Like I said, whatever Piers and Dimitri experienced with those first few people who gave them a really positive response, like what was it that they did? And I'm sure it was a really simple thing. They might not even know that they did it, but the worst thing they could have done is something that turned Piers and Dimitri off. So I don't know what it was that they did, other than just be really open-minded. And in their mind, they might have been thinking, bloody hell, I don't know how this is going to work. But they didn't say that. They just said, yeah, let's give it a go. We'll find a way.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a role that language like has to play in that discussion, in the attitudes that people are presenting, or do you think it's a moot point, you know, and it's mindset that's the challenge?
I'd be interested in Piers and Dim's view in this, but I'll give a response. I do think language is important to a certain point, but I do think sometimes language, if we overplay the importance of language, I think it just makes people even more fearful, even afraid to speak. So as long as people are not being like really offensive and derogatory and discriminatory with their language, that's fine. But let's not bash people over the head because they said able-bodied and they should have said a non-disabled or able, like those type of nuances. So I think I'm always a bit, not that I sit on the fence, I recognize it is important, but if you push it too hard, I think it does the opposite to what we're trying to do. But I'd really value Piers and Dim's view on that as well.
Yeah, I completely, I couldn't agree more, to be honest. I think, yeah, language is important, but I think more specifically communication rather than just the words that are used. So does the person you're speaking to understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to say to them? And there's, I'm not saying that you can just say whatever you want to people. I mean, as a general rule, that's not usually something that would be good, able-bodied or disabled. But do you know what I mean? At the end of the day, you need to be able to have trust with whoever you're speaking to and know that you're talking to them in a way that you're trying to help them improve, and that's what they want as well. So for me, I think just establishing a good relationship and a good, open, honest communication so that you can get what you need to be said across is probably the more important thing, rather than just the words that are used.
Yeah, for me, I completely agree with these guys. I think the more you focus on language, the more you're focusing on the wrong thing. And like, yeah, even for example, this conversation. So for me, I use the word able-bodied. Like for me, like some people don't like that word. So if someone says to me, "Look, I don't like that word. Do you mind not using it?" Sure, you completely respect that. But for me, that's the word I use. I'm happy with that one. If anyone uses it, I think like Nick said, it's like unless they're being deliberately offensive. But but that would be the same with anything. And I think, yeah, for me, I've experienced a lot where people disability is different, particularly when you're in a wheelchair. You're really obvious. People don't know how to act, and I say one of the big problems is, so for example, outside of a fencing world, when I go around town, you're treated very differently. People talk to you like you don't have a brain, you don't understand. They either give like a huge distance, like you got the plague, or then they panic and run out of the way. And you try to talk to people, they just kind of like they freeze and they panic. I think a good example as well is like where, I'll be pushing up a hill. When you do this abroad, people always be like, "Oh, do you want a hand?" And I'm like, "Nah, I'm all right, cool, cheers." They head off, or Turkey, they just pushed you no matter what, wherever you went. Whereas I'd say in England,
Yeah.
people are almost too scared. And like every single time this happens, people always get and they're like, "Oh, um, I don't want to be offensive, but maybe you want some help," and they're too scared to ask if I want help. And for me, if someone wants to help push up a hill, whether I want or not, that's really kind and it's always welcome. But I think so many people, they're too scared, like, oh, if I ask, maybe it's offensive. If I don't ask, is that also offensive? And so they kind of like panic. And so I think the more language is pushed as, in a sort of 1984 totalitarian way of you can't say this, you can't say that, then I think the more people they either resent it, or they're just like, you know what, I don't even know what to call him. I don't know what to say. I'm just not going to bother talking to him. Um, so yeah, I think definitely as long as you're not being deliberate with it, then yeah, I think just accept, like yeah, that's where I kind of sit in it really. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something I always often say in like is if you're too scared to do like to start, so to be supportive, then you're already doing something wrong. Like if oh, I'm gonna get it wrong, so I won't do anything. Oh well, no, okay, you've already got it wrong because you're not being inclusive.
Mhm.
Um, and so yeah, that fear is a big challenge. The activity alliance say the psychological barriers to participation are the biggest barriers that we need to overcome. Um, and in terms of that, like you mentioned earlier that your first coaches sat you in a chair, plastic chair, and just got on with fencing. Do you think that methodology is still, valid in today, like, a decade and more on? Do you think, if someone it like that's enough to be welcoming and then we'll sort it out later?
Yeah, I think there's the same idea of like how I think as a disabled person you have to be tolerant because yeah, like as Nick said, the world's not made for us, Um, and so I think as long as you've got that mindset of like, look, I think you've got to push for equality where you can, but you've also got to accept that look, nothing's going to be perfect, and you have to kind of accept that. And so I think for me, if I was going now, starting off at a club, I'd kind of accept, look, there's going to be people that have never seen someone like me, never done water fencing. There's going to be some, like for me personally, there was always like these ancient coaches that would use words that were quite funny or quite offensive if someone younger said it to me. But you kind of have to accept, look, that was the word they used in those days. They don't mean any harm. So you just have to sort of crack on. And so I think as long as you understand that, yeah, they don't mean harm by it. It's just the word they use. That I think that's fine. And so I think you really have. I think for our perspective, you have to have that openness to be like, look, people don't know what to say. They don't know how to act. So accept a bit of awkwardness. But I think from their side, I think as long as they're doing what they can to make you feel welcome and they mean no harm, then I think that's a good thing.
Like, so what would you say is the biggest barrier to progression from someone who wants to start? They've got into a club, they started, and now they're trying to move into that like performance space, into that like high performance space. What's the biggest barriers to that progression?
Probably the understanding of what it means to be an athlete. And again, it's a bit difficult because I think, yeah, I think being a good fencer and being a true athlete are two very different things. Being a good athlete is an embodiment of behaviors that benefit anyone in a high performing environment, sport or not. And those principles of, we've touched on them before, constantly questioning, consistency, striving for excellence under pressure, all these kind of things are behaviors or things that you look for that have got nothing to do with the sport. Whereas I think for someone who comes from potentially a club environment and is looking to get to a more high performing elite environment, that could potentially be, I think, a bit of a culture shock. Because I know certainly from my perspective, I was in a bit of a weird position where, if I'm being honest, I say I wasn't a great athlete for the first, well, for a long time at the beginning of my career. But really from improving that and really taking, on board, people like Piers' advice and many others on what it actually takes, what it means to be a good athlete, then I found that my fencing performance became a lot more consistent because of my behaviors and the changes that made. So I think for me, that could be, if you have those attitudes and those attributes, then, great. But I think that is something that would be probably the biggest difference between club and then progressing up a level.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, completely agree with Dim. I think that sort of mindset really is key. I'd say that there was also like the sort of infrastructure as well. I'd say like so if like in other countries, I'd say that the sort of the structure's a lot better from sort of the transition from grassroots to elite level. I think where we struggle is it's like a huge jump. And I think you can get, like, so for example, nationally, you can get so far by just fencing once a week at the club, going to a competition and getting so far. But to then go international, it's a very different level. And I think from a sort of, actually, there's not many full-time clubs in the UK. There's like a couple that actually have their own venue, whereas abroad, they have their own purpose-built centers. People train there all the time. And financially as well, I think to be an elite athlete, you either have to be a millionaire or friends or family or put everything out for you. So I'd say that, and yeah, even more so for disabled athletes. So I'd say there's definitely sort of being able to do it from a sort of psychological sense of how can you really make all its improvements, make the best of it, but also acknowledging that structurally we do struggle. Do you know what I mean?
I feel like we're so lucky hearing from the three of you talking about all this, and like I could go on forever having these conversations because you're such very well considered individuals, and you know your realms so well. Um, but I do have to wrap up at some point, so we're going to move towards that. Um, like, what do you think? What would you like to see change in fencing or Nick in sport in general? Um, over the next 5 to 10 years to make it become more inclusive? Like, what would you love to see change?
Sorry, was that to me, Rick?
Well, to all three of you, whoever comes first. But yeah, Nick, you go first with sport, and
Uh,
then we'll focus down onto fencing again, I guess.
Yeah, I'll go first, and it's a bit of a bombshell, really. So it's kind of feels a bit weird to throw this bomb in right at the end. Although
We got 20 minutes. It's okay.
Dim did speak to it earlier. Is look, the reality is, particularly in the Olympic Paralympic system in the UK, there is one type of medal that's valued more than the other type of medal. And so I'm being blunt here, but we have to talk about this because this is an elephant in the system. The Olympic medal is seen as more valuable than the Paralympic medal. It's better than it was, 10, 20 years ago when I first came in, but it's still overwhelmingly so. The system favors the Olympic medal and the Paralympic medal. Most coaches would favor the Olympic medal and the Paralympic medal. And most sports, like even in integrated sports where you have Olympic and Paralympic in the same sport, if I'm being brutally honest, and this is an uncomfortable thing to talk about, the Olympic, if they could only win one medal at an Olympic or Paralympic Games, and you ask them to choose, which one would you rather win, Olympic or Paralympic? I'm not sure you'd hear Paralympic come up too many times. So the one thing I would love to shift is that whatever this bias is that we have to the Olympic medal is more valuable than a Paralympic bias. And I'm pretty sure I'm not making that up. I can see Piers and Dim nodding, because that value proposition plays out in loads of different ways to what it feels like when you're an athlete in a Paralympic program. I dare say if Dim and Piers were Olympic medalists in fencing, their reputation profile within fencing community would be much higher than what it currently is. So I think there's some stuff that needs to change. There is no rule, there's no book, there's nothing that says this is more valuable than that. We have chosen as a system to place our value on one over the other based on historic, deep-rooted, dare I say it, archaic views around disability and non-disability. So that's the one thing I would like to see change. And whether it's equality or equity, we can have a whole debate around the differences of, but the bottom line is more value placed on this, and therefore much more deliberate doing in this area, and doing the things that the things that need to be different, we do them better. And our coaching is better, our infrastructures are better, our training environments are better. I'm sure Piers and Dim would love to just be able to get on a plane and travel to whichever competition, or even just to go on holiday without worrying about whether their wheelchair is going to be there at the end of the flight or not. Like, that's just unacceptable. Yeah. And, Dim also spoke to the Equal Play campaign that BPA was supporting, which I think, don't quote me on this, guys, but I think that the figure it's shockingly scary for a country like us in this day and age, that 75% of disabled children are excluded from are not being active in PE or school sport. I mean, that's just a frightening statistic.
It's utterly appalling.
Yeah. When you actually think about what that means, it's criminal. It shouldn't be happening. So why are we allowing it to happen? And that just has to change. So sorry, I've jumped around on a whole bunch of things and thrown some big grenades in there, but we have to talk about these things, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, this is a Paralympic torch from 2012. It's silver. The Olympic torch from the same year was gold. I mean, if that doesn't show it, like, that reference, yeah. I agree. And earlier, I don't know, I think it was Piers who mentioned that you're being paid less than Olympic athletes on the same sort of, which is absolutely wild, because you're having to pay more for things like your wheelchairs to get anywhere. Like, I think the average difference in a disabled person's monthly cost is over £1,000 now, according to the kind of research from Scope. And obviously, there's not an average person, so that can vary. But I think for every athlete, disabled people have so many more equipment challenges than their non-disabled counterparts. We mentioned football. If you wanted to go out and play football and you're not a wheelchair user, you just go out with a football. A person who's a wheelchair user has to have a football too, but then they have to have a wheelchair that can move in that space. So yeah, like, I agree with you, Nick. It's absolutely shocking.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good one to talk about, because I think it is always sort of ignored or tried to be hidden. Do you know what I mean? And I'd say, like, even just so from a couple of aspects, it's like, I'd say to be an elite athlete, you have to be from a completely privileged background. So I'd say, like, so for me personally, I was only able to get funding to help me train, help me sort of, I was full time, but to get actually to support me with that, I had to win 3 back-to-back World Cup golds. It's impossible to do that without being full time. And the only people that are able to go full time to be able to win those medals, to get results, are trust fund babies, rich people, people from privileged backgrounds. And so this is why, when you look at athletes across the UK sports system, it's almost all people who have a certain background. And I think that's one thing needs to change, even taking out disability. Then I'd say disability on top of that. Yeah, and I think I'm really glad you said it, Nick, where it's like, it definitely is valued hugely differently. So one of the things me and Dim are challenging at the moment is, within the UK sport policy, that it says, if you're if you're a Paralympic athlete, you get this level. If you're an Olympic athlete, you get that level. And so they're literally saying in writing that Olympic gold's worth this much thousand for an athlete's APA, and Paralympics worth this. And So from our perspective, it's like, how is this legal? The Equality Act should have taken out things like this, and I think a good example of this is us and the pentathletes. So, we fence with them. We train a couple of meters away from them every day. We're in the gym together, in the fencing sessions together. If anything, we train train more on ours, from what we've seen. And yet their medals are worth more than ours, So we're filling the same job for less pay simply because we have a disability which we can't change. So I'd say from the top level, that's definitely an issue. Even on TV and stuff, you never see Paralympic sport. People always talk about, the Olympics, and they never mention even Paralympics. And I think so. I'd say that's the issues we face at the top level, and as well, one of the main ones for us is, you know, if we get respect, which isn't often, it's as wheelchair fencers, not as fencers or not as athletes. And I'd say then going down to the sort of grassroots level, for me, the key thing is the gold standard would be an equal sort of path, for everyone. So if an able-bodied person can go to a club, join a taster session a week, a week out, well, then the disabled person should be able to have the same path. So I think that should be the kind of gold standard for everyone. It's like same path, whichever way you take from the start right to the top.
We're working on it, guys. We're trying. Dimitri, do you have anything to add?
I think, again, thank you, Nick, for bringing it up, because I think it is one of the biggest disappointments that I found, in terms of support in general for para-athletes. I think it's a tough system in general, as Piers mentioned, but for an already, and this isn't like a pity thing of, poor us, but like it is more expensive and it is tough living with a disability, especially in this country. So why is something, if anything, like more money has to go into into a disabled athlete to get them to the same level. So why is that not being reflected? And I think the climate is changing as well. Parasport is vastly becoming more and more and more professional. Like all it takes is to look at some of the other countries, the level of support that they have, the level of training that they have. I think China again appreciate that they're that's the other end of the scale, shall we say? But full-time 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day, 6 days a week for 10 years before they even make their first World Cup. And we're expected to compete against that with our current support. And while yes, that's an extreme example, there are countless other countries who pay their athletes for their training the same way that they pay the Olympic athletes of that same sport, of that same country, for their training. So I appreciate that there are a lot of issues in today's society and that the UK are facing. We're not necessarily asking for us to exactly replicate that, because that may not be possible, especially given the current model. But I think the bare minimum would be equality, and I think equality of respect and equality of opportunity.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
That would be lovely, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And like to say, we've got the Equality Act. It's the Equality Act 2010. Before that, we had the Disability Discrimination Act. We're about 30 years since then, and still we're seeing these challenges. It's a frustrating space to be in for sure. But I'm going to do a little roundup if I can, and feel free to add to it if I've missed something that you feel is really vital, and then we'll go to member questions for the last 10 minutes. So we've just heard from just these incredible brains, some of our best athletes in the sport right now, and Nik Diaper, who's clearly doing an incredible amount of work in supporting in the equality and the growth of Paralympic recognition. So once having heard this, please, if you're a coach, club owner, fencer, go back and think of what can you take from this conversation. What can you do to make your club more welcoming for disabled people? What can you do to learn from our world-class program and bring it back into your coaching and into your practice, whether or not you're a standing or seated athlete? Please also do check out a lot of the resources that we've been developing, that I've been developing alongside my colleagues at British Fencing to help you be more inclusive by visiting our website. Now I'm going to now pause so that we can go to questions from our participants. But before I do that, thank you so much, guys, for all of your for all of your time today and all of your work in the sports ecosphere to try and make the world a better place for everyone in it. So thank you so much for that. Well, we've got a lot of thinking going on. Yeah. So do you think that there's somewhere like what if someone doesn't have a local club, what could they do on their own?
So I'd say if there's a fencer that that doesn't have access to a local club, but I think a really good way is just that same mentality of like, what have you got available to you? So actually, like if you've got a frame, maybe, do you know what I mean? Or you've got not got, how can you just move in the chair to get used to that movement? How can you move the maximum? Okay, cool. You've not got a frame. Actually, why don't you go do some cardio? What if you watch YouTube videos? What if you get a training diary and start writing out ideas of what you could do when you are able to then access some training? So it really is that thing of, how can you just whatever you've got available, still do something that gets you towards your goal?
Brilliant.
It's a similar principle of like if I was injured, for example, and I wasn't able to fence, how could I still be doing something to help my overall development, so kind of imagine it that way. I think there's a lot more to fencing than just the actual fencing. So yeah, use whatever you can. I know I used to, again, practice the feeling of a hit with a ruler when I was at school. Maybe I should have been focusing a bit more on my lessons, but I mean, like there's always things that you can do, and while it's not going to be exactly the same thing, you can still, I think there are still improvements to be made just from that thing of, cool, what have you got available to you, give it a go.
Great. Nick?
It's difficult to know the context that question is coming from, because if that's someone who has sort of their heart or their ambition to become a fencer, then despite everything that Piers and Dim have said, at some point you're going to have to try and solve the obvious problem that the question is relating to of how do I get to a club to fence. Again, it depends on what the intent, why the person wants to fence, and how much they care about it. So I think everything Dim and Piers have said, obviously very practical in the short term, but I think we're making an assumption that that's a short-term fix until at some point the problem that needs to be fixed gets fixed. And so whoever that person is Dim and Piers in a much better position than I to say what you can do in the interim. But at some point you've got to either work with the federation or whoever it is to make a bit of noise and find out like how I want to fence. Where is my nearest club? I don't know. Look, start your own club.
Yeah.
If you really want to do it that much, like could you create a case to start a club in a local leisure centre? I think the beauty of seated fencing, let's call it seated fencing rather than wheelchair fencing for now, you don't need a specialist facility. Again, I'm probably unqualified to say that, but you don't need like a full-on fencing cell or something. You just need a space. And that space could be a studio in a like a Pilates studio in your local leisure center. So that I think, at some point you've got to address the elephant that's in the system, which is I need to get to a fencing club.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the SwordSeat, I can get 3 of them in the back of my car and a bag of fencing kit and go anywhere to run a come try event. So that does open up opportunities. I've often heard from clubs going, oh, we don't have the space for seated fencing because all of that, we're busy running. I'm like, that's wild, because you've got all these pieces with people running back and forth all the time. Cut one in half and you've got enough space for 2 people, for 4 people to participate. So yeah, you're right there. Okay, so from another one from the chat, how important is it for you to have an identity as you rather than as the athlete, the athlete itself, or is that the same? I wonder if that's the same really. How do you program your individual coaches to support you as a person rather than as a robot that's fencing?
I don't know. I think for me, who you are and your athlete who you are going to be linked. Do you know what I mean? Like there are going to be elements of your individuality which will really help you in your development. And then also, again, speaking from personal experience, there are elements of your personality that are going to be quite detrimental to what a good athlete is. I know I've had to do a lot of work to kind of combat that and make sure I'm being consistent and doing the things that I need to do. I think it's important, like I said, it's important to be just accepting of yourself and know that, okay, fine, I know this is who I am. This is something I'm potentially going to struggle with. But if developing and improving is that important to you, how can you get yourself to do what you need to do? And there are a lot of different ways of doing that. Piers and I don't have the same life necessary lifestyle, and we even though we turn up and train very similar hours and do similar things, the way we go about those are going to be very different. And I think use individuality as an understanding of how to get to where you need to go, not always as an excuse, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really tough balance because, like the reality, I think people in sport talk about a lot about okay, life outside of fencing, okay, this and that, and the reality is you have to give everything to fencing to get to the top. Yeah, so like for me, I went sort of full time age 15, I quit all my studies, quit everything else, and just basically went full time. And for me, it's like I'd do that all over again because you kind of have to. Do you know what I mean? I think for me personally as well, I wanted to like maybe it wasn't the most sensible option, but for me, if I was going to do it, I wanted to give 100%. And so there where people try to say, okay, you're not going to be an athlete forever. You need to think about the future. You need to have some new time. To me, it was like, well, that's only taking away from my dream and my sort of profession of fencing. So, but I'd say now, I was very resistant to it when I was younger, but I'd say now as I'm older, I can really see that actually one of the biggest benefits of having a life outside of fencing is just keeping you sane. Um, I think a good example, yeah, like we talked about the first question of what's the games like. Literally you've got you have that feeling of 4 years, you've got someone with a gun to your head telling you you're never gonna make it, you're never gonna make it, you've got this, you need to get this one thing perfect in 4 years' time on this one day, and it's always there, that feeling of that immense pressure inside that thing's always there. And actually you get home from training, you're tired, just on a let you got a couple hours to do something before you go to sleep and get up the next day. Actually you got that nagging thing in the back of your mind being like, go on, just do a bit more planning, just do a bit more video analysis, just do an extra cardio session, and it's easy to give into that, and then you end up just for this, the pressure builds and builds and builds and builds until it's too much. Whereas I think where it works really well is you're able to sort of really sort of separate sort of me time and then sport time. So look, this is my time. I'm going to give 100% to my training, and this time I'm going to give 100% to myself and my hobbies. Um, so for me, look, I've got half hour. I'm going to stick on a Pink Floyd vinyl. That's a bit of me time. I'm not going to think about fencing, think about anything else. And there you've got a bit of you time. Where you're not thinking about it. You're then so much more refreshed for the next day's training. And as well, like it just keeps you from getting too pressured as well when you get close to the games.
Bro.
I'll add to that, Rick, because I think it's a very emotional but really important topic, because the research does show that one of the challenges for athletes, if you only have one identity, which is me as an athlete or me as a Paralympian, when that identity is taken away from you, or you choose to retire, or the challenge for athletes is sometimes it's not your decision whether you retire or not. You might get deselected or injured, or in the para case, classification could change and you're out. The research shows that the more identities you have, whether it's as an athlete or as a father or a student or a professional or whatever it is, that's less likely to have longer term some of the mental health challenges that can emerge for athletes when they retire. And I think what we're beginning to understand is actually how deep-rooted the identity as a Paralympian is in the Paralympic context. So we spoke earlier about some of the differences between Olympic and Paralympic. I mean, that identity is strong. I think it feels like it's even stronger in the Paralympic sense. And once that's gone, it can be quite a lonely, difficult place for people. So Piers and Dimitri have said how challenging it is to just, as Piers said, everyone is telling you should do this, but the reality is you need so much time on task that it's difficult to find the time and space to do it. And I think, as Piers was saying, perhaps when athletes get a bit further on in their career is when these type of things start to come into their mind. So it is important, and I think the system has to do a better job of supporting transition from athletes, for a longer term, not just short transition periods when they retire. I once heard a para athlete say to me, when they retired, I was a Paralympian, now I'm just a disabled person in society again. It was because of the way they were meant to feel, environment that you're coming from that is designed for you, all your needs are met, and then suddenly you're out there in a society that is now, not built for you, and can be challenging. So that's why I said it's emotive, but it's a really important one in terms of just longer term mental health and support for athletes.
Yeah, and I'd say I guess society has an impact on that as well, because everyone who's disabled who gets out and about is assumed to be a Paralympian when
Yes,
by the general public.
Yeah.
So if you were a Paralympian and now you're not anymore, that must be even harder than those of us who've never been a Paralympian and get asked if we are in the supermarket every day.
Yeah.
So I've run over time. But if I can take another 5 or 10 minutes just to give the opportunity to the people who've been sitting quietly listening, to ask any questions that they've had. Is that okay, guys?
Yep.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
I'll have an initial stab, but there's obviously a lot there. So I think, interestingly, and again, don't quote me on this, but I think what we're finding in elite athletes in the UK, there's a much higher prevalence of neurodiversity within elite athletes in the UK. So you could argue that there are certain traits that people who have neurodivergent traits that are beneficial to high performance sport, which is interesting. So, but I think I would summarize everything that the conversation we've had in the last hour or so as somewhere in that conversation, what we're saying is the more inclusive we can make fencing as a sport, or just sport in general for people with an impairment, is ultimately what we're trying to do. So I don't think there is a simple, elegant answer, because we recognize that it's challenging. But I hear the point you're saying, Erica, in that the risk for certain people with certain disabilities or neurodivergent traits is that if they can't engage in social activities like sport, there's a higher risk that they start to deviate into criminal behaviors or things like that. So as a preventative measure, I do hear your suggestion, and I'm not an expert in the area, clearly you are, that one of the other reasons to make our sporting offers more inclusive, not just fencing but all across all sports, is an important reason for that. So sorry, that's a bit clunky. And in answer to your specific question to me earlier on, the short answer is yes, we do collaborate with other nations in the Paralympic sense. We are getting better at it. I think we used to be a bit protective, because sometimes we take the view of, well, we don't want to give away our competitive advantage to other nations, so therefore they are the enemy. We shouldn't communicate with them. But I think we're realizing more and more that there is a lot of value in working together with other nations. The British Paralympic Association do it very well every Paralympic game to ensure the environments at the games are appropriate. And I know some sports, and I think Dim and Piers probably do this in a fencing sense, go on training camps with other nations, because actually it's a much healthier training environment to train with different fencing styles and learn different things than it is to take a view of, no, we mustn't train with the other teams because we'll give away all our competitive advantage. We've got lots of skilled, technical, tactical sports that take that view. So sorry, that's my attempt at an answer.
Well, thanks, Nick.
Thank you it was a really thought-provoking session. I know I'm here sort of a British fencing staff member, but I'm a sports coach, and Piers, Dimitri, your achievements and the resilience you've shown is really inspiring, and Nik, your passion and allyship is really infectious. And Rick, thank you for hosting such a great session.
Welcome. Well, thanks everyone. Yeah, and thanks guys. I'd love to have hours and hours sitting with you guys. I think I can, we could solve the world's problems and then not do anything about it the next day, or at least continue doing what we're doing already, but whilst feeling better about it. But yeah, thank you so much for your insight and your time. It's really appreciated.
No, cheers, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for hosting this.
All right.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.